Death at Bishop's Keep, Chapter 52. And thereby hangs a tale. William Shakespeare, As You Like It, Act 2, Part 7. "Oh, and how did it feel when the gun went off, please, Mr. Mudd?" Harriet begged. She was sitting on the sofa, her eyes dancing with excitement. Sarah Pratt leaned back in her chair, her slippered feet elevated to the warmth of the fire on a stool cushioned with a small pillow. She looked around, replete with satisfaction. All the comforts had been restored to the servants' hall, including tea and jam. Things were as they should be, although it was a sad day. Just this morning they had buried Miss Ardley and her sister. The service had been read by the vicar and attended by almost every resident of the village and surrounding countryside. Sarah felt that everything had been quite in order, although the morning might have been a bit less wet. It was tea time now, and the autumn rain was driving against the window. Pocket had brought in a bucket of chestnuts to roast in the fire, and as he had every meal since the event, Mudd was retelling with enormous relish the tale of his grand adventure with the young miss. "We can't have the gun afore we have the cart," Neddy objected, playing with the terrier's ears. On Jagger's death she had befriended the sad dog. "How did you get to Colchester, Mr. Mudd?" Mudd obligingly shifted the focus of his story. "As you know, I drove the young miss in the pony cart," he said with an understanding glance at Pocket, who always got sulky at this point in the narrative. When Pocket first learned what happened, he protested that Mudd had unfairly usurped his prerogative, for it was his job to drive. But he objected far less after he discovered that Mudd's assignment had involved not just driving the cart, but, upon instruction from the young miss, forcing open Miss Farnsworth's kitchen door, stealing surreptitiously up the back stairs, and waiting outside the parlour with an ear to the door until finally it opened and the lady with the derringer came out. Sarah noticed that Pocket always turned away when Mudd described the silvery gun with the walnut handle, so small that it fitted into a lady's hand, yet so powerful that the bullet blasted through a mirror and buried itself in the wall behind it. "I don't care to hear about the pony cart," Amelia pouted. She gave Mudd a flirtatious sideway glance. "That's too ordinary. I want to hear about the gun, Mr. Mudd. That's the dangerous part." Pocket's ears reddened and he became busy with the chestnuts. "Well then," Mudd said, basking in Amelia's glance, "the young miss comes out of the parlour with the lady who had the gun." Neddy pushed the terrier out of her lap. "How can she be a lady," she asked tartly, "if she had a gun?" "Let that be, Neddy," Sarah said, pouring herself another cup of tea. "A lady can have anything she wants." "She had a gun," Mudd repeated patiently, "which I already knew, for I heard the young miss say, quite loud and pert, that it is a rather small gun. Is it real?" "So brave, the young miss," Amelia sighed. Sarah savoured the image of her mistress fearlessly holding her ground in the face of a lady with a gun. Any ordinary woman would have fainted dead away, and the villain would have escaped. "Brave," Sarah confirmed, adding sugar to her tea, "and generous too." Miss Ardley had planned to allow them tea, but she had said nothing about sugar. It was the young miss who had instructed her to see liberally, but not wastefully, to the comforts of the servants, because Sarah was no longer simply cook, but cook-housekeeper, and a much enlarged ring of keys dangled at the waist of her apron. In point of fact, Sarah had more to think about than the comforts of the fire and the tea and the jam, delightful as those things were, especially on a day like today. The young miss, who was very businesslike and efficient when it came to running the household, had set her to counting everything straight away. All the kitchen stores, the linen, the silver, the china, and crystal, and even the furniture. Making an inventory, she called it. It was a demanding task that required all of Sarah's skills of observation, organization, and writing, and as she moved from room to room, noting each item in a book, along with its precise function, condition, and location, she began to think of herself. Her estimation of her abilities rose further when she consulted with Miss Ardley and Mudd, as now required on the household accounts. If she could do these things, she could manage 3 subordinate house servants, yes, even 4 or 5 or 6, with no difficulty at all. "So I'm waiting by the door," Mudd continued, primed, you might say, for action. "And when they come out, I grab the lady right round the waist." At this point he always leaned suggestively toward Amelia and offered to demonstrate, which of course Sarah could not allow. She frowned to remind both Maud and Amelia that such play acting was not necessary to the authenticity of the tale. So then the gun goes off. Bang! Harriet said happily. And the bullet breaks the mirror into the tiniest pieces, Nettie added, like little diamonds. And then the policemen come, Amelia put in. Yes, and Sir Charles too, Maud said, pretending not to notice that his arm was slipping along the top of the sofa in the direction of Amelia's shoulder. The one who took the photograph of this self-same lady selling poisonous mushroom to Mrs. P. Dressed up like a gypsy, Harriet crowed, clapping her hands. And that's why Cook went to jail, because of the gypsy mushroom. What got in the pudding? Nettie looked respectfully at Cook. Can you tell again about riding to the jail in the carriage, Miss Pratt? Sarah smiled benignly for the moment, ignoring the fact that Amelia was leaning ever so slightly toward Maud. Riding in the carriage to and from the jail was a subject she loved to talk about indeed. She dwelled on it in her waking hours and dreamed about it in her sleep. And not just the breathtaking speed and smoothness of the ride, or the feel of the fine leather seats, but the astonishment of the faces of her friends as she rattled along High Street, going in glory. Since Miss Kate had given her such a generous gift, Sarah had felt quite differently about herself. She had even begun to believe it possible, as Rachel Elam's dairyman brother claimed in his letters home, that a person might actually rise above her station of birth, might even aspire to something like, she thought with a catch of her breath, a shop of her own. She shook the thought out of her head and smiled again at Nettie. Later, child, she said in a kindly tone. There's something I need to hear from Mr. Mudd. She bowed to Mudd with some deference. One had to feel a certain regard for a man who had so bravely stepped in to save the young miss from being taken to the cellar and done away with. Although Sarah suggested that, given the necessity, the young miss could have taken perfectly care of herself. You no doubt told it, Mudd, as he said, but I've never quite got this part straight. How was it that the constable come so prompt-like, just as the gun went off? I didn't get the straight of that of myself till this morning, Mudd replied. When I read it in the newspaper, it appears the lady had already murdered somebody else. No! Amelia squealed, her hands going to her mouth. Yes, Mudd said, lowering his voice and making it dreadful. A Frenchie with a gold ring. She made him tipsy and drove him in his hired rig out to the excavation. Then she stuck a dagger in his heart and shoved him into a pit. Harriet's eyes grew large and she gave a faint moan. She could have been no lady, Nettie said firmly. She began to count on her fingers. I make it 3 she murdered, and she would probably murder the young miss, which is 4, if she hadn't been stopped. No lady would have murdered so many, not even for sport. Cook looked at Mudd. How did the police come to know? According to the newspaper, Mudd said, Sir Charles deduced who killed the Frenchie, or near enough. He was bringing the police to talk to the lady. They were on the stoop at the very self-same instant that the gun went off. And then they arrested the lady, Harriet said. You see, they declared triumphantly, if she were a lady, she wouldn't have been arrested. "'Twere a great piece of luck that was there, Mr. Mudd," Sarah said. "That would have been an awful pity to have lost young Miss so soon after losing Miss Hartley. God rest her, and Jaggers, the devil take her," she added factually. "If the young Miss had gone, we'd all been out of place, instead of warming ourselves by the fire with tea and chestnuts." Mudd spoke sternly, imbued with a sense of new authority. "Don't speak ill of the dead, Mrs. P." But Sarah did not reply. She was gazing into the fire, warm, contented, and full of chestnuts. And she was wondering, if she could ever have her own shop, what kind of shop would it be? The comfortable silence was broken by the tinkle of the drawing-room bell. "I'm wanted," Amelia said and rose. "I'll go with you," Mudd said with alacrity, and rose as well. "Pocket, perhaps you'd better see that lame horse." Pocket grudgingly acquiesced, and the 3 of them left the room. Miss Pratt glanced up at the clock on the mantel. "Time for lessons," she said. Nettie clapped her hands, her face glowing. "Come on, Bandit," she said to her terrier. "Time for lessons." Harriet, who thought of herself as older and wiser, twisted rebelliously. "When I got my place, I thought I was through with lessons." "Well, you was wrong, wasn't you?" Cook said. "Miss Kate wants you to tippy-twitchy to get on in the world, so you'd best be at it. You don't want to make fools of yourself when you recite for her in the morning." She reached under her chair and pulled out a copy of the London Times that Miss Kate had given him, with the explicit but inexplicable instruction that the girls were to practice reading the first page aloud until they could read it smoothly and well. Handing the newspaper to an eager Nettie, she warned, And don't fret at the time. 15 minutes or lessons, and then I'll see you in the kitchens. There's work to be done." "Yes, Mrs. Pratt," the girls chorused dutifully. Mrs. Pratt swung her feet off her stool and stood up. When she thought about the changes at Bishop Keep, it all seemed rather queer. But still, none of the alterations, with the exception of the sad loss of Miss Ardley, were excessively hard to bear. She went off to the kitchen. Miss Pratt was humming a tune under her breath.